Hi Post-16, welcome back to our weekly community briefing. Coming to you from my home to your home. I hope that you're all safe and well and that you are coping successfully with lockdown as it progresses into its 6th week now. I'm continuing to post things for you on our community Google Classroom. I'm trying to put a variety of things on there for you, from announcements that you need to know about for school, as well as things that might be helping you to get through this difficult period. We are hoping that it won't be very much longer and we'll be able to post the definitive word on there from Pearson about what's happening with BTECs if you're in year 13. Please keep working on your coursework until you hear information from us. We know that it's going to be after the 9th of May that we hear from Pearson. So keep working on your coursework for the time being. So this week's focus in briefing on our parade standards is going to be about equality. And lots of people, when the lockdown first started, said that COVID-19 would be the world's great leveller, the world's great equaliser, that we would all be forced into a situation, no matter where we lived in the world, to all of us have our lives restricted by our governments, and that therefore it would make us all equal with one another. And I've been giving that quite a lot of thought during this period of lockdown. Now, in some ways, being on lockdown has made us all equal. We're all in isolation, for example. We're all restricted on where we can go physically in the world. We've all had to find new ways of doing things, new ways of communicating with one another. We've all had to establish new daily routines. We've all had to be physically separated from people that we love and care about. So in a great many ways, COVID-19 has made us all more equal. But as becomes increasingly obvious when you watch the news now, COVID-19 is also exposing a huge amount of inequality in the world as well. What happens, for example, if you aren't lucky enough to have a garden that you can go and spend time in, that you say you live in a flat where you don't have any outside space? There are people coming out of in a very limited way out of lockdown in Italy and Spain at the moment, who have literally been trapped indoors inside the four walls of their flat with no outside space for the last 6 or 7 weeks. What happens if you are from a low income household and maybe your parents have lost their ability to earn money? Supposing you were one of the people that relied on free school meals, and that has become difficult to access now. Supposing you're a person who relies on human interaction to be able to get the best out of yourself, and that might be something that lots of you have struggled with when it comes to getting your schoolwork completed. It might actually be that you feel less equal from an educational perspective now because you haven't got other people to bounce ideas off, and you haven't got a teacher physically there in the room to encourage you to learn what you need to learn. In a great many ways, as a result, COVID-19 has actually exposed lots of inequality. And I don't think very many people now would argue that COVID-19 is the great equaliser that people thought it was going to be at the start of this crisis. It certainly doesn't even come close to being an equaliser when it comes to countries in the developing world. What happens when the virus reaches sub-Saharan Africa in a major way, or reaches refugees living in a Syrian refugee camp? It's going to be terrible if that happens. No equality whatsoever there. Those countries just are not as prepared as the developed world. So COVID-19 cannot be called the great equaliser. So I've been thinking, how has this situation provided one surefire guaranteed way of equalising everyone, particularly in a time of lockdown. So my thought this week for you to ponder is very much linked to that concept, and taking it from history. From the early 13th century onwards, so we're talking about the Middle Ages here, when Europe and the UK were very much more religious countries. We know that people used to become nuns and they would go and live in nunneries or convents. We know that people would become monks and go and live in monasteries who wanted to devote themselves to God. But there was a very interesting subset of religiously minded people during that period who were known as anchorites or anchoresses. And these were people who decided that it wasn't enough that they should enter into a convent or a monastery to devote themselves to God, but they decided they needed to completely separate themselves from the world. And they would go to religious houses like churches or monasteries or convents, and they would voluntarily isolate themselves for the rest of their lives within a room in those buildings. And quite often what would happen is when someone took vows to become an anchorite, if they were male, or an anchoress, if they were female, they would be put into their room, usually on average about 10 feet square, and then the door to that room would be bricked up. Once they were inside that room, they would never leave again. And there were 3 windows in the room. When they were built and designed, they had 3 windows. One window would be a door back into the would be a window back into the building that their room was part of, so that a servant could bring them food and take away their human waste every day. Then there would be another window that would face into the church itself, so that they could pray and participate in church services from behind the confines of their 4 walls. And then there would be a third window where they would, which would face out onto the street. It would face out to the world. It would face out to the public, and that was to give them an opportunity to contemplate the world, but also for people who were living their ordinary lives to go and visit them and ask them for spiritual guidance. So the lives that they lived were incredibly isolated, bricked up inside a 10 by 10 room with only 3 windows, one for spiritual purposes, one for practical purposes, and one to provide some community interaction. Now, the rooms that they were locked up in were known as anchor holds, and that's why they were called anchorites and anchoresses. And the reason for this is because the room that they isolated themselves in became their anchor. It fixed them in one specific place in the world. Now, when we think about anchors today, anchors are what boats and ships use to keep them fixed in one place in exactly the same way. But a boat or a ship will lower its anchor to root itself in one place on the seabed to keep itself safe, to stop it drifting, to prevent it from being pulled onto rocks. So anchors are associated with safety, and all of us today in our isolation are being asked to stay in our own homes to keep us safe and to keep other people safe, to limit the transmission of the COVID-19 virus. So the anchor holds that anchorites and anchoresses had back in the Middle Ages are actually very similar to the homes that we are in now, where we have created our own anchor holds, our own places of safety. Now, how did an anchorite or an anchoress spend their life? Well, they spent it in prayer and contemplation, and they used those years and years and years of self-isolation to ponder themselves, their own spiritual sense of who they were, to establish positive and meaningful relationships with God, but also to observe the world, to identify their own place in the world, to work out where they belonged in the world, to work out what their purpose was, and maybe what the purpose of humanity was going on outside of their window. It gave them a chance to contemplate who they were within their community, the role that they played, and the position that they had within their communities. And that's why there was always a window that opened onto the street to allow for that community interaction. It also gave them a chance to look inward, to find out things about themselves that they didn't know before, and to have moments of self-discovery or revelation as they learnt more and more about themselves. Now, it occurs to me that we don't live our lives in as strictly isolated way as anchorites and anchoresses did, but we are all within our own kind of anchor hold. This here is my anchor hold. I'm spending most of the day, most days, here inside the four walls of my own anchor hold at home, as are you at your homes with your families. And there are opportunities for us now to have moments of self-discovery, moments of revelation, moments of connecting with our communities in a different way, and an opportunity to take a step back from our lives as we knew them before, and the pressures and the expectations that are placed on us on a daily basis by living in the 21st century. We have those opportunities now to step back and to look inward, to find out things about ourselves, to develop things about ourselves, and to imagine our place in the community as it was, and our place in the community as it could be when we come out of this period of isolation. We, like the anchorites and the anchoresses of the Middle Ages, have an opportunity to reimagine ourselves and to reimagine the world that we want to come out to after this period of isolation. And so my thought this week for you is for you to try and reframe this period of isolation as an opportunity, something positive, where we've all been given a rare, probably once in a lifetime opportunity to step back from our lives, to look inward, to evaluate, and to make plans for who we want to be in the future and what we want our world to be like. You may find that in reframing how you're thinking about isolation, that you find it very much easier to cope with, and that you start to see it as a really positive thing, aside from all the obvious benefits of keeping ourselves and our communities safe from this terrible virus. Thanks very much, Post-16, and I'll see you next week.